London, in the winter of 1814, wore a pall of muted frost, as though the city itself grieved the long years of war that had thinned its coffers and its joy. Through the drifting fog, carriages rattled along Grosvenor Square, their lamps glowing like wavering stars, while inside the Duchess of Leamington's grand townhouse, a charity tea gathered the most curious and least charitable of society. It was here, beneath chandeliers that glittered with cold indifference, that Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood exposed to the quiet cruelty of whispers. 23, graceful, intelligent, and far too aware of her diminishing prospects, she lifted her chin with practiced dignity, even as a circle of elegantly dressed matrons assessed her like a damaged heirloom. Her father's death had stripped her of protection, her dwindling dowry had stripped her of desirability. Yet she endured the scrutiny with the brittle composure of a woman who knew her survival depended on appearing untouched by disgrace, even when humiliation pressed against her like the winter chill. At the far end of the room, Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ravensbury, observed the unfolding scene with the cool detachment of a man accustomed to cataloguing political theatrics. Recently returned from Vienna, he had hoped for one evening free of speculation, one night unburdened by demands that he accept a marriage orchestrated by the crown. Yet even surrounded by opulence, he felt the pressure of expectation settle against his shoulders like invisible armor. His reputation for restraint had only encouraged society's fascination, and the whispers trailing him were nearly as sharp as those surrounding Eleanor. He recognized her immediately, though she seemed altered, tempered by grief, diminished by circumstance, and yet, in a strange way, strengthened by the very adversity attempting to crush her. As she stood isolated, he recalled evenings at her father's table, where she had debated matters of state with a clarity and passion that rivaled many statesmen. Seeing her now, forced into silence, stirred something in him that felt dangerously like indignation. Her humiliation reached its sharpest point when Viscount Halston approached with the stiff politeness of a man performing a social duty he no longer desired to uphold. His bow was shallow, his smile rehearsed, and his retreat, after a mere exchange of pleasantries, swift enough to ignite a fresh flurry of gossip. Eleanor felt each whispered word like a pinprick, though she refused to let her expression falter. Her composure was her final armor, and she clung to it with the desperation of a woman who understood that reputation, once tarnished, rarely regained its original luster. When the Duke crossed the room, the murmurs shifted instantly, drawn to the gravity of his presence. He greeted her with the same formality he offered any lady of rank, yet there was warmth beneath the surface, a subtle refusal to treat her as though she were already fading into irrelevance. His acknowledgment alone unsettled the delicate balance of the room, and Eleanor sensed the air stirring with new speculation. She left the event shortly after, choosing the sharp bite of winter over the suffocating sweetness of false sympathy. Her carriage wheels cut through slush as she returned to Ashcombe House, a once prosperous residence now dimmed by disuse. Inside, the air carried the scent of extinguished fires and dwindling hope. A letter awaited her on the hall table, its seal unmistakable. Her cousin, Percival Ashcombe, had written again to remind her that the estate, her home, her history, would revert to him by the new year if she did not marry. The words pressed against her chest with a weight that felt greater than any humiliation she had endured in public. Marriage, once a distant expectation, now loomed as an ultimatum. She understood the stakes clearly. Without a husband, she would lose everything her parents had fought to preserve, and the small freedoms she still possessed would vanish into a life dictated entirely by the whims of a man who cared little for her well-being. While Eleanor faced a future narrowing with every passing hour, the Duke returned to Ravensbury House with a storm brewing in his thoughts. His advisers awaited him in the study, prepared to renew their arguments that he must accept the marriage proposed by the Crown. They spoke of alliances, stability, and the necessity of appearing compliant during a fragile moment in England's political landscape. Adrian listened with the outward patience of a man schooled in diplomacy, yet inwardly he felt the walls closing around him. He had spent years negotiating with foreign officials, only to find his own life reduced to the maneuverings of others. When the conversation ended, he dismissed them with a restrained courtesy, but their warnings echoed in his mind. Refusal could cost him influence, favor, perhaps even the quiet autonomy he still guarded. As he stood before the window, watching the fog swallow the city, the memory of Eleanor's strained composure lingered like a question he could not yet name. Eleanor slept little that night, rising before dawn to stand at the window where frost had crept across the glass like delicate veins. She felt suspended between dread and determination, fully aware that time was no longer an ally. If she did nothing, her fate would be sealed by men who viewed her existence through the narrow lens of convenience. She would not surrender her life so quietly. The thought unsettled her, stirring the remnants of the confidence she once possessed. Yet she had no plan, no certain path. Only the echo of the Duke's kindness and the realization that he was wrestling with burdens of his own. As the first weak light seeped into the sky, she resolved to attend the upcoming Grosvenor Ball, a final attempt to secure a match before the season faded. She had no reason to expect anything beyond indifference, but necessity demanded boldness. What she did not know was that Adrian, too, would attend with his own intentions, and the intersection of both lives would alter the course of them forever. The Grosvenor Ball unfurled like a glittering tapestry of candlelight, music and expectation, its grand halls vibrating with the murmured hopes and quiet schemes that defined London society. Eleanor arrived early, her gown modest yet carefully mended, the soft silver embroidery along the sleeves catching what little light she dared to claim. Every step she took through the marble foyer was measured, each breath drawn with the fragile resolve of someone performing courage rather than feeling it. She had promised herself she would not shrink tonight. If a husband must be found, then she would meet her fate with open eyes, not trembling hesitation. Yet as she crossed the threshold into the ballroom, she felt the familiar prickle of scrutiny tighten around her. Conversations paused, glances sharpened. Even so, she forced herself to continue, nodding politely to those who barely nodded back. She had endured worse, she reminded herself. She could endure this too. Unbeknownst to her, Adrian Blackwell entered only moments later, a tall, composed figure whose presence commanded attention even before he spoke a word. Unlike the restless young gentleman crowding the room, Adrian carried himself with the weary elegance of a man accustomed to watching nations shift like tides. The crown's expectations had followed him into the evening, their weight reinforced by the subtle vigilance of courtiers scattered through the crowd. Yet as he surveyed the ballroom, his gaze did not seek political allies or rivals. It found Eleanor, standing near an ornamental column, her posture dignified despite the faint shadow of apprehension that softened her expression. Something in him steadied at the sight. Her quiet endurance struck him as more admirable than any brilliance displayed by the polished debutantes swirling past him in vibrant gowns. He had chosen this evening for a purpose, and seeing her now only confirmed the necessity of it. He approached her slowly, aware of how his every movement altered the room's current. Conversations dipped, hands stilled over fans, and expressions shifted with the anticipation of fresh gossip. Eleanor sensed him before she saw him and steeled herself, uncertain whether his presence would offer safety or spark more whispers. When he reached her, he bowed with courtly precision and addressed her in a voice pitched just low enough for her ears alone. He asked for a moment of her time, and though she hesitated, propriety and curiosity compelled her to accept. He guided her toward a quieter alcove, its shadows softened by the warm flicker of wall sconces, and once they were out of immediate sight, he spoke with an earnestness that startled her. He explained that both of them stood on precarious ground, though for different reasons. She faced the loss of her home, he faced the tightening snare of political expectation. Their misfortunes, he suggested, aligned with an unusual symmetry. His proposition emerged with careful restraint. If she agreed to appear as his intended bride, they could shield each other from the threats looming over their futures. She would gain security and the protection of his title. He would buy time to refuse the crown's chosen match without public humiliation or diplomatic uproar. Eleanor listened, each sentence threading through her with equal measures of relief and anxiety. The offer was remarkable, almost impossibly so, and yet not reckless. It was, in its own way, a contract forged from necessity rather than sentiment. But necessity alone was never simple. Eleanor questioned him with a firmness that surprised them both, asking whether he sought merely a convenient disguise or expected obedience disguised as partnership. Adrian answered without evasion. He wished for neither domination nor deceit, only an arrangement built upon mutual benefit and discretion. If she agreed, he would uphold her dignity and protect her estate. If she refused, he would respect her choice. His candor disarmed her, though a quiet uncertainty lingered. She had been underestimated so often that distrust had woven itself into her instincts. Yet she could not deny the logic of his proposal, nor the sincerity in his tone. She accepted, not with eager gratitude, but with thoughtful resolve, the resolve of a woman reclaiming agency in whatever shape it was offered. Their pact took its first public test only days later when they strolled together through the Christmas market in Covent Garden, their pace unhurried, their conversation measured. The market glowed beneath strings of lanterns, casting warm pools of light across stalls selling ribbons, sugared almonds, and handcrafted toys. The air carried the mingled scents of roasted chestnuts and pine garlands. Children darted between vendors, while musicians played gentle carols that softened the winter air. Eleanor found herself momentarily charmed by the scene, though she remained acutely aware of the eyes upon them. As they paused beside a stall adorned with tin ornaments, Adrian offered her a small wax-sealed envelope, its contents unmentioned. She accepted it with polite confusion, and he explained quietly that it was intended for charity. Only later, when she opened it in private and discovered a sum large enough to support several widows' households, did she feel her breath catch. He could not have known how deeply such a gesture would affect her, or how closely it aligned with the secret work she carried out at great personal risk. The market outing ignited interest across London almost instantly. Tatler published a sketch the next morning of the two of them beside a vendor's stall, their expressions softened by lantern light. Society reacted with a blend of fascination and unease. Some claimed Eleanor was cunning enough to ensnare the Duke, others insisted Adrian must be rebelling against the crown's influence. Invitations multiplied, though each one carried the thinly veiled curiosity of hostesses eager to observe the pair firsthand. Eleanor felt the scrutiny like a constant draft under a closed door, but she bore it with surprising steadiness. The Duke's presence offered a shield, and within its shelter, she found herself breathing more freely than she had in months. Their next appearance came at a masquerade ball, where Eleanor wore her mother's old gown refashioned into something modest yet elegant. The mask she chose was a simple silver piece edged with pale lace, allowing her expression to remain visible enough for comfort. Under the chandelier's glow, the soft hues of her attire made her seem almost ethereal. When Adrian saw her across the room, he paused, not in admiration of her beauty alone, but in recognition of her quiet transformation. She no longer looked like a woman cornered by circumstance. She looked like someone reclaiming her place in the world. When he asked her to dance, she accepted, though her pulse raced with the tension of being so closely observed. As they moved through the measured steps of the waltz, their conversation slipped into unexpected intimacy. Adrian spoke of the strain of his diplomatic years, of the loneliness that lingered even in rooms filled with power. Eleanor listened with quiet attention, sensing the vulnerability beneath his words. When she in turn confessed her discomfort with society's disdain, he replied with a gravity that unsettled her. He admired not the image she presented, but the strength she concealed. His voice carried a subtle warmth that made her uncertain whether he spoke as a conspirator or something more dangerous. The tenderness of the moment fractured when Lady Seraphina confronted Eleanor behind a velvet curtain, her tone laced with accusation. She warned Eleanor that the crown did not look kindly upon those who meddled with its intentions, and hinted that Adrian's association with her might bring consequences. Eleanor absorbed the blow in silence, but the words reopened every wound she had tried to seal. Before she could steady herself, Adrian approached, but she slipped away into the night air before he could speak. The fog swallowed her figure, leaving him standing alone beneath the ballroom's glowing windows, uncertain whether he had just witnessed the beginning of trust or its sudden undoing. The night air clung to Eleanor like a damp shroud as she stepped out onto the terrace, her breath unfurling in pale ribbons that dissolved into the fog. The distant music of the masquerade drifted behind her, each waltz a reminder of the world she could not fully claim. She found a quiet corner near a balustrade overlooking the dark garden, where frost dusted every hedge like powdered silver. Her pulse had not yet settled from Lady Seraphina's warning. It had felt like a blade wrapped in silk, dangerous not because of its sharpness, but because of its precision. She knew well enough that the crown's displeasure was not an idle threat. Yet the moment that struck her deepest was not Seraphina's malice, but the flicker of something indefinable in Adrian's eyes just minutes earlier, something that had made her feel seen in a way she had not expected nor prepared for. She had fled because she needed air, space, clarity, anything to soften the tumult rising within her. Adrian found her sooner than she wished. His footsteps approached with a deliberate calm that betrayed none of the concern stirring beneath his composed exterior. When he reached her, he paused a few paces away, as though unsure whether the fragile quiet around her could bear the weight of his presence. She turned slightly, her expression caught between apology and defiance. He bowed his head, not out of formality but out of respect, and spoke her name with a softness that dispelled the last of her resolve to keep him at a distance. He asked whether she had been threatened, his voice edged with the restrained fury of a man accustomed to solving problems others feared to name. Eleanor shook her head, though her trembling hands told another story. She confessed that Seraphina had merely reminded her of the precariousness of their arrangement, and of the consequences she might invite by aligning herself with him. Something shifted in Adrian, subtle but unmistakable. His posture straightened, as though he had heard an accusation against himself, rather than a warning directed at her. He told her that Seraphina had overstepped, and that her words carried no authority beyond spite. Yet Eleanor pressed further, her questions threading toward the heart of their growing tension. She asked whether he believed she was strong enough to bear what society would inevitably hurl at her. She asked whether he understood that aligning herself with him meant surrendering the last of her anonymity. And finally, in a whisper nearly lost to the wind, she asked whether he truly wished for her partnership, or merely the illusion of one. Adrian's reply emerged with a quiet gravity that startled even him. He admitted that when the arrangement began, he had sought only a mutual shield, nothing more. But he could no longer claim that such simplicity remained. He had seen her courage, her loyalty, her capacity to endure the unendurable without bending to malice. He could not ignore the truth that had taken root. She mattered to him, not as convenience but as something far more precious, though he lacked the language to name it without unsettling everything between them. Eleanor absorbed his confession with a mixture of gratitude and dread. Afraid of hope, she turned back toward the garden, her fingers brushing the frost-bitten stone of the balustrade. The conversation might have softened into something tender had fate not intervened. A sharp rustle broke through the fog, followed by the hushed murmur of unfamiliar voices. Eleanor stiffened. Adrian stepped forward instinctively, positioning himself between her and the shadows. Moments later, two figures emerged from the mist, messengers bearing the discreet insignia of the Foreign Office. Their presence confirmed what Eleanor had feared: whatever calm Adrian sought tonight would not be granted. The men bowed and delivered a sealed dispatch, their faces drawn with urgency. Adrian dismissed them quickly, but Eleanor could sense the weight in his grip as he held the letter. Her heart tightened with apprehension. Political affairs were rarely gentle, and never meaningless. When he broke the seal, his expression altered, sharpening with the cold certainty of a man confronted by unwelcome demands. The Crown, he explained, required his immediate cooperation regarding the diplomatic marriage he had sought to avoid. Pressure from Vienna had intensified, and rumors of his involvement with Eleanor had already reached international ears. The arrangement they had crafted was no longer a private pact, it had become ammunition for those who wished to manipulate him. Eleanor listened with mounting dread, her earlier fears now unfolding with cruel clarity. She realized that by stepping into his world, she had exposed him to consequences she could not shield him from. But Adrian, refusing to accept the narrative thrust upon him, insisted that the Crown's interference only strengthened his resolve. He would not be coerced, nor would he allow Eleanor to bear the weight of decisions made by men who neither knew nor respected her. Even so, the situation demanded action. Eleanor understood that secrecy now posed a greater threat than truth. She suggested cautiously that they consider announcing their engagement publicly, not as a strategic illusion, but as a declaration strong enough to counter the crown's pressure. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not from fear of him, but from the enormity of what she was suggesting. Adrian stared at her, struck by the courage it took to propose such a step, especially when the consequences would alter the course of her life forever. He asked whether she could make such a commitment without affection, without certainty of what the future might bring. Eleanor replied with a clarity that surprised them both. She trusted his honor, and though she did not yet know what lay between them, she believed it was something worth choosing rather than avoiding. Before he could respond, a sudden commotion erupted from inside the ballroom. A footman appeared at the terrace entrance, out of breath, reporting that Lady Seraphina had collapsed after an altercation with a guest. The message was delivered quickly, but the implication lingered. Seraphina had wielded gossip like a weapon. Now that weapon had evidently struck back. The interruption shattered the fragile moment between them, yet it also offered an unexpected clarity. Eleanor looked at Adrian, seeing in him not only a duke burdened by duty but a man standing at a crossroads. He extended his hand, not as part of their arrangement, but as a plea for trust. Eleanor hesitated for the span of a heartbeat before placing her hand in his. The decision, though small in gesture, reshaped the path ahead. Together, they re-entered the ballroom, their clasped hands drawing attention, speculation, and whispered astonishment. And though uncertainty followed them like a silent shadow, neither released the other. Their next steps would demand courage neither had fully realized they possessed, but the first step had been taken.